So today is the first talk in a series of talks on great female disciples of the Buddha. So up till now, for the last couple of months, we've been talking about great male disciples of the Buddha. So I'm very honored to be here to talk about a really amazing woman who became an arahat at the time of the Buddha. So when I was given this topic for the talk, I went downstairs and bought this book, which I recommend to anyone who's interested in this topic, The Great Disciples of the Buddha, edited by Bhikkhu Bodhi. And I went through it and read all the female disciples, looking to see which one resonated the most with me. And one stood out from the others, but she only had a few pages written about her. So I went online and saw that there was only a very small bit written about her online too. But I still wanted to talk about her. So today you'll get a little lagniappe. Lagniappe is a New Orleans word. I'm from New Orleans, and it means a little something extra. So I'm going to talk about another woman who is a modern woman who also became an arahat, and her name is Dipa Ma. And I also have a strong affinity for her. I've read her book a couple of times and really love her story, so I'm very honored to speak about her too today. So my hope is that these stories will instill in you faith and confidence that you can attain at least the first stage of enlightenment, if not every stage of enlightenment in this life. These women's stories are very inspirational in that they were just people like you and I who had strong faith and strong conviction and determination and energy, and just worked really hard at the same techniques that we learn here. And through that determination, they were able to achieve these noble attainments. So to begin with, I'll start with Sona. She stood out to me, one, because she's a mother, and I'm a mother. One of my children's downstairs, Chloe, in the library right now. And also because unlike some of the other disciples at the time of the Buddha, it's not said that she ever actually met the Buddha. So a lot of the disciples, they met the Buddha, and the Buddha knew exactly the right thing to say to them to bring them to awakening. But she did not meet the Buddha. It was through her strong determination that she made her way to enlightenment. And that resonates with me because I'm not going to be able to meet the Buddha. So her history, she was born and she lived in Savatthi during the time of the Buddha. She was married and she had 10 children. So this is fascinating to me that anyone could have energy after raising 10 children to then become awakened. But she did. She spent her whole life while her children were young, of course, caring for them and nursing them and being pregnant, and then arranging their marriages. So this in and of itself is a huge job to arrange marriages for 10 children. So she didn't find time for spiritual matters at this stage in her life. Her husband, on the other hand, was a follower of the Buddha, and he lived his life impeccably following the precepts. So once her children were grown, her husband decided that he was going to leave home, and he was going to ordain and become a bhikkhu. This was hard on Sona, and she decided that she would, I guess, kind of take advantage of her children being gone and her husband being gone, though, to lead a more devout life. And she did this by handing over all of her possessions and her wealth to her children. And she asked them to give her what she needed when she asked for it. So in this way, she was getting closer to becoming a bhikkhuni, a nun, but while still at home. Now this worked well until Sona grew old, And when she grew old, it became a burden to her children to care for her in this way and to handle, I guess, her finances. And it's said that her children never really accepted their parents' way of life. They didn't understand why they wouldn't use their wealth for the pleasures that money can buy. And she ended up being resentful and kind of hurt and a little bit bitter by the ridicule that her children ended up feeling towards her for her decisions and for this burden. And because she was already aware enough, she had the insight to see this within her own mind. She saw that this bitterness arising, and she saw these unwholesome states. And she realized that this was not where she wanted to be. That she wanted to have a selfless love, that she didn't want to have self-love. She wanted to be unconditionally loving to everyone and to her children. So she reflected on this and she decided that she would join the order of bhikkhunis, although she was quite advanced in age at this point. So she ordained, and she had this idea in her mind that by ordaining, all of her troubles would disappear. She kind of fell for the grass is greener mentality that we all kind of get trapped into. And she saw her life as a householder as gray and oppressive, and she really thought that just by ordaining, she would have peace of heart and her life would be bright and beautiful. Well, it didn't exactly work that way. She still had these mental factors, these unwholesome things that were arising in her, even when she ordained. And she had the additional trouble of having the nuns that she was living with be much younger than her. And they did not accept that it was hard for her to assimilate into their culture. She had particularities and she had habits that it was hard for her to break. So they criticized her and they gave Sona a hard time. And this caused her additional suffering. So she knew it was going to take a tremendous amount of effort and energy for her to get to the stages of awakening that she wanted to be at. But she wasn't turned off by the work that it was going to take. She was diligent and had this strong spirit. And she knew that she was going to have to increase these traits that she lacked of energy and circumspection. She saw that she had a lot of emotionality that would arise, and she didn't have good control over these emotions. She knew she'd have to practice mindfulness and self-observation, and she would have to implant into memory teachings that would help her to counteract her emotions. So this is a practice we do at Maba with chanting. We chant the sutras every week, and by doing this, we implant them in our memory. So hopefully we can bring these back to mind when we're struggling with strong emotions, and they can help us. She thought, what good are the vows if she was just going to get carried away with her emotions and react based on them? And this thought gave her determination to give herself fully to the training. So Sona had a compelling sense of urgency. She'd spend all night, some nights, in meditation. And this I found interesting, was what's spoken about with her is that the meditation she did was walking meditation. A lot of times we hear about masters and arahats who spend their time in sitting meditation. But she would spend all night walking. She would have a room dark so she wouldn't disturb the other bhikkhunis, and she would walk holding on to pillars because she was older, or very old at this point, and she wouldn't sleep much at all. And because she would spend so many hours in walking meditation, she built up tremendous energy and a lot of momentum. So energy is a theme that is found in both of the stories that I'm going to talk about. Energy is very important in Buddhism. It's a whole another talk in and of itself. But it's one of the 5 spiritual faculties. It's one of the 10 paramis, or perfections. And it's one of the 7 factors of enlightenment. So energy is a very important and necessary quality to have on this path. So her arahatship, she speaks in her own words of her arahatship in the Apadana. And what she says is, "Then the other bhikkhunis left me alone in the convent. They gave me instructions to boil a cauldron of water. Having fetched the water, I poured it into the cauldron. I put the cauldron on the stove and sat. Then my mind became composed. I saw the aggregates as impermanent. I saw them as suffering and non-self. Having expelled all the cankers from my heart, right there I attained arahatship." So it's nice to hear her own words. And there's a lot of teachings in this one paragraph, I think. She talks about this kind of one-pointedness of mind, which is concentration. She talks about impermanence, the aggregates, which is what we're made of. And she talks about suffering and non-self. And these are the 3 insights that a person gains to attain arahatship. And she also talked about cankers, which we were speaking about in the Dhammapada class this morning. Canker is a sore, and it's something that is kind of a metaphor for what happens to us when we have attachments. And it's the hindrances and the fetters that we get rid of when we attain arahatship. So when the nuns returned, the water was not boiled yet. So in one account, Sona was worried that the nuns would accrue bad karma by speaking ill of her for not having remembered to boil the water. And so because she was so compassionate to them, she boils the water before they come in with her mind. So she has this superpower that we hear about a lot with the arahats, that comes with really deep concentration and these higher stages. In the Great Disciples of the Buddha, the story is a little different. When they come in, she then sets the water to boil with her mind, and they see her do this. And they report to the Buddha that she's done this. And he rejoices, and he recites a verse that's found in the Dhammapada. He says, "Though one should live 100 years as a lazy, sluggish person, better it is to live a single day firmly arousing one's energy." So again, with the energy, how important that is. So to end the story of Sona, she speaks in her own words again about her entire story. And she says, "I bore 10 children in this body, in this physical frame of mine. Then when I was old and frail, I went up to a bhikkhuni. She gave me a discourse on the teaching, on the aggregates, sense bases, elements. Having heard the Dhamma discourse from her, I shaved my hair and then went forth. When still a probationer, I purified the divine eye. Now I know my past abodes. Where is it that I lived before? With one pointed mind, well composed, I developed the signless state. Immediately I was released, quenched with the end of clinging. The 5 aggregates are fully understood. They stand cut off at the root. Fie on you, O wretched aging. Now there is no more rebecoming." So that is Sona. Now let's fast forward a couple of thousand years to the year 1911 in India. There's a woman who's born who's named Nani Bala Barua. And the book that's written about her that I mentioned earlier is entitled Dipa Ma, The Life and Legacy of a Buddhist Master by Amy Schmidt. And I recommend this book to everyone. The first half tells her life story, and the second half of the book is anecdotal accounts of her students and people who knew her, and a lot of her own words as well. It's very interesting. So some may be familiar with her. She became known in America because she's a teacher of Jack Kornfield and Joseph Goldstein and Sharon Salzberg. And these are three well-known Buddhist teachers that started the Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts. And I've seen a few stories of Dipa Ma popping up on the internet lately, on Lion's Roar and some of the other Buddhist sites. So I'm happy that she's becoming a little bit more known. So she's a woman who experienced tremendous amounts of suffering in her life. And through this, she developed a tremendous determination and energy, just as Sona had, to reach liberation. She was always very interested in Buddhism. She was born in Bengal in India, and she was born into a Buddhist community. So she knew of Buddhism, and as a child she loved school, and when the children would go out at recess, instead of playing with the children, she would build altars to the Buddha, and she would do rituals to the Buddha when she was a young girl. Sadly, she was forced to quit school at the age of 12 to get married, and she was arranged to be married to a 25-year-old. And she lived with her in-laws for 2 years before living with her husband. And this caused her discomfort and fear because she just did not know them, and she was only 12, and she didn't get along with them extremely well. I think it just kind of talks about how she was uncomfortable and fearful of them. So at the age of 14, she moves in with her husband, and then for a long time, she tries to conceive a child, and she's unable to. So her in-laws talk to her husband and to ask him to marry someone else, to leave her. He refuses to do this, and he goes to Dipa Ma, who is still Nani at this point. And he tells her, to comfort her, that she should try and love all beings as her child. So this is a teaching that she takes forth through her life. When she was 18 years old, her mother dies. A repeating theme that happens throughout her life is when she has this suffering, she gets very physically ill. So the grief causes her physical illness as well. So after her mother dies, she becomes very sick. At this point, she has, I think this is when she gets heart disease. And her and her husband take in her younger brother, who was 18 months at the time. And they move to Burma. So her tragic story continues, sadly. At the age of 35, she finally conceives a child after 20 years of infertility. This baby's a girl, but she dies at 3 months old. She, again, continues with her illness from the grief of this loss. And then 4 years later, she conceives again and has a girl who survives. And this child is named Dipa. And this is where she gets her name from, Dipa Ma, which means mother of Dipa. She then becomes pregnant for a son when Dipa is a toddler. This child dies at birth. And her sorrow was so strong after this loss that she demanded to be allowed to learn meditation. Her husband refused. But Dipa Ma was very, very determined. She told her husband that she was going to sneak out at night and go find someone to teach her meditation. She knew that this was the only way she was going to overcome these sorrows. So her husband actually hires friends to keep watch over the house at night to make sure she doesn't leave. He was very determined that she not learn meditation at this point in her life. But he doesn't have to keep these friends watching for too long because unfortunately she becomes bedbound with illness at this point. So her husband nurses her and takes care of Dipa and works full-time as an engineer. And this stress is too much for him. He has a heart attack and he dies. So she's lost children, 2 children, her mother and her husband at this point. So she goes to sleep one night. She feels she's very close to death. And the Buddha comes to her in a dream. And he softly chants a verse from the Dhammapada. He says, "Clinging to what is dear brings sorrow. Clinging to what is dear brings fear. The one who is entirely free from endearment, there is no sorrow or fear." So when she awoke, she felt calm and clear. So from this point on, she knows she has got to learn meditation. So she gives all of her possessions over to a neighbor, and she has someone watch Dipa. And she finds a meditation center. She goes to the meditation center with the thought in her mind that she's going to stay there until she dies. And she gets instructed in Vipassana meditation. And she sits down to meditate, and she's meditating for a few hours, the first day she's ever meditated. And she gets up to walk with her meditation instructor, outside I assume, and she has trouble moving her leg, and she can't figure out why she can't walk forward. So she's trying to move her leg, and it's not working, and she looks down, and there's a dog attached to her leg biting her. But her concentration was so strong, she didn't feel the dog biting her leg. She just felt the inability to move forward. So we see from this point that she has a very natural inclination towards meditation. So because of the dog bite, she has to go to the hospital and get rabies shots. And at the meditation center, they only eat 1 meal a day, as a lot of monastics do, and they eat before noon. And so she misses the meals, having to travel to the hospital, and she becomes too weak and she has to go home. So she goes home to Dipa, and she kind of starts her life back at home. And she carries on with the meditation practice that she was instructed, but always with this idea in her heart that she was going to go back one day. She was going to find a master and go to retreats and continue on this path. Now, years later, a friend invites her to practice with Mahasi Sayadaw, who is a very renowned Burmese meditation master that is very well known to Buddhists around the world. And Dipa Ma's sister and her family move in nearby. So this was very fortuitous. She had someone there that could watch Dipa, who was a part of the family. So she went to Mahasi Sayadaw, and she learned from him. And she, on her first retreat, she entered such deep states of concentration that she passed through the Theravadan stages of insight, which is a map that's in the Theravadan school, these different stages you go through when you progress. And she attained stream entry. At this point, she was 53 years old. Now, during her next retreat, she entered the second stage of enlightenment, once returner. And she carries on and is said to have attained all the stages. People who knew her were amazed by her transformation. She was no longer ill and frail and sorrowful. Now she was a radiant being. She continued on this path of enlightenment, as I said, attaining all the stages. It said that she went on to master all the superpowers, as Sona had, and the jhanas. Once she decided to stay in the 8th jhana for 3 days, 21 hours, 8 minutes, and 3 seconds. And she did so up to the second. She said to have radiated loving kindness to all. Now, in her words, she says, "You have seen me. I was disheartened and broken down due to the loss of my husband and children and due to disease. I suffered so much I could not walk properly. But now how are you finding me? All of my disease is gone. I am refreshed and there is nothing in my mind. There is no sorrow, no grief. I am quite happy. So Dipa Ma ends up being known as kind of the saint of householders. She ends up back in Calcutta, and she's living in her small apartment with her daughter, Dipa. And people would hear of her, and they would come and see her to seek out instruction and guidance. And this was a very poor community. People were very busy, lots of children, lots of responsibilities, so not a lot of time. But she had a tendency and a knack to find exactly the right practical instruction to give people. And an example of this is there was a neighbor who was a mother with 6 small kids, and she was nursing. And what Dipa Ma instructed her to do was to use the sensation of her baby nursing as her meditation object. So because she had this experience multiple hours a day nursing this baby, she was able to focus on these sensations. And it's said that just by using this meditation object, she attained stream entry. And there are many stories of people in similar situations or just very, very busy. And Dipa Ma would always say, there's always time. You can wake up 2 hours early and meditate, go to sleep 2 hours later and meditate. And because you're meditating so many hours, you're not going to need as much sleep. And you're going to really gain a lot of energy. So she's very inspirational to us householders, I think. So some of her teachings were that you cannot separate meditation from life, that the whole path of mindfulness is whatever you're doing to be aware of it. And she believed that enlightenment was the purpose of human life and the primary purpose for meditation practice. She told her students, you must practice to know at least one stage of enlightenment. Otherwise, you have not made use of your human life. So she was quite hardcore. So Jack Kornfield asked her once what was in her mind. And she closed her eyes and quietly answered, in my mind there are 3 things: concentration, loving kindness, and peace. And he asked, is that all? She responded, yes, that's all. He laughed at that. One time she was asked a question about this kind of equanimity that you gain, if that would cause life to lose its color and if everything would kind of become gray. And her response was, oh, you don't understand. And she burst out laughing. She says, there is so much sameness in ordinary life. We are always experiencing everything through the same set of lenses. Once greed, hatred, and delusion are gone, you see everything fresh and new all the time. Every moment is new. Life was dull before. Now, every day, every moment is full of taste and zest. So she was an incredibly inspirational householder who truly positively affected everyone she came in contact with. I hope her story is as encouraging to you as it was to me. And to end, I'm going to recite one of Dipa Ma's blessings that's found in her book. By the grace of the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, may everything be good to you. May you be happy. May you be protected from harm. And may you progress in your meditation. I will always be with you. Thank you for your attention.